Hey guys, normally I come out all excited, enthusiastic, but today is a little more serious in tone. If you guys want to review your big truths, I will have that in the description below. Please stay up with that. Please stay up with your New Testament Bible reading. Remember, a chapter a day and 2 chapters on Sunday, and we'll make it through the New Testament in May. So, there's only one God, and He created all things, so He owns everything. So if He owns everything, He's the rightful ruler over everything. And if He's the rightful ruler over everything, then He can do what He wants with whatever He wants. And last time we talked about how God is in control of the good things that happen, the blessings. But this week we're going to talk about how God is in control of the bad things that happen as well. And this is hard to understand because God is only good and not evil. He is light, and in Him is no darkness at all. So how is it possible that God's in control of the bad things that happen? That's what we're going to talk about this week. Isaiah 45, 5-7 says, I am Yahweh, and there is no other. Besides me there is no God. I equip you, though you do not know me, that people may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none besides me. I am Yahweh, and there is no other. I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am Yahweh who does all these things. It was the greatest tragedy that Judah had ever experienced. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had come and destroyed everything they loved. Practicing siege warfare, Nebuchadnezzar's army surrounded the city of Jerusalem and waited. He didn't let anybody in or anybody out. So eventually their food ran out and people began to starve. Disease entered the city and people began to die. And when they were at their sickest and weakest and most vulnerable, then Nebuchadnezzar's army attacked. They used their siege weapons, their primitive machinery, to destroy the walls of Jerusalem. That was the people who lived there. That was their protection. That was their safety. And then he destroyed the temple, their sacred site, their holy place. This is where the people went to pray and to sing to God and to offer Him sacrifices. This was where the Ark of the Covenant was. This is where the people believed God's presence lived, and Nebuchadnezzar destroyed it. He destroyed the walls, he destroyed the temple, and he destroyed their city. It's the city that they called the joy of the whole earth. And then Nebuchadnezzar's army slaughtered men and women and kids. And those who were left, he took most of those back as captives to Babylon, where they lived as strangers. They lived in a strange country where they spoke a strange language and wore strange clothes and worshipped strange gods. And the people were heartbroken. They were devastated. They couldn't understand why God would let this happen. They missed their families who were now dead. They missed their city that was now destroyed. They missed the temple that was now gone. Decades passed and the people were still captives in Babylon, wondering why all this happened. And then Yahweh spoke through the prophet Isaiah. Let's look at it again. I am Yahweh, and there is no other. Besides me there is no God. I equip you, though you do not know me, that people may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none beside me. I am Yahweh, and there is no other. I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am Yahweh who does all these things. By this time, there was a king named Cyrus who was ruling over Babylon. Cyrus was very arrogant and worshipped false gods. Archaeologists have found a document that they refer to as the Cyrus Cylinder. And in the Cyrus cylinder, Cyrus praises the false god Marduk for putting him in the palace, for making him king. Cyrus encourages the people to pray to the false gods Bel and Nabu. He thanks these false gods for making him king. And Yahweh steps in and says, "No, I am God and there is none other. There is no such thing as Marduk. There is no such thing as Bel or Nabu. They didn't make you king. They didn't promote you to the palace. I did." Yahweh says, "I'm the one who allowed Nebuchadnezzar's army to surround Jerusalem. I'm the one that allowed them to destroy the walls and the temple and the city." He says, "I'm the one who allowed them to kill people and to take people into captivity." And this is shocking and this is hard to understand because God is the one who allowed all this bad stuff to happen. Look what he says in verse 9. "Woe to him who strives with him who formed him, a pot among earthen pots. Does the clay say to him who forms it, 'What are you making?' Or, 'Your work has no handles'?" Have you ever seen a potter making pottery like on a potter's wheel, spinning that lumpy, brown, slimy hunk of clay around and around? It starts as something ugly and disgusting, and he or she makes something beautiful out of it. Has it ever happened in the history of pottery where the ugly lump of clay is like, "How dare you make me into something beautiful? What's wrong with you?" Or like, "Hey, you forgot the handles. I should have handles." Even if clay could talk, that would make absolutely no sense because the potter's the artist. The potter's the master. The potter's the one that's going to make something beautiful out of something ugly. And you see, God has a plan. And the plan is bigger than me as an individual. The plan is bigger than you as an individual. He has this great big cosmic plan that he's bringing about. He's the potter. We're just the clay. Did you know that the people of Jerusalem eventually went back to Jerusalem? Did you know that they rebuilt the walls and the temple and the city? And do you know who it was who made the decree for them to go back? It was Cyrus. You see, Marduk didn't put him in the palace. Yahweh did. Yahweh put him in the palace because Yahweh had a plan all along. He allowed this arrogant king, this arrogant man to become king because Yahweh had a plan to bring his people home. And we don't always see why Yahweh's doing what he's doing. But he has this great, big, cosmic, wonderful, beautiful plan that brings glory to himself. Notice what it says in verses 22 and 23. "Turn to me and be saved, all the ends of the earth, for I am God and there is no other. By myself I have sworn, from my mouth has gone out in righteousness a word that shall not return. To me every knee shall bow, every tongue shall swear allegiance." You see, in good times and in bad times, God is in complete control, bringing about his plan to save sinners from all over the world. And it's glorious. It was the tragedy of my young life. I was 13 years old, and my best friend, my cousin, was murdered. Richard Edward Johnson Jr. and I were born the same year, but my birthday was before the school deadline. His birthday was after, so I was a grade ahead of him. But we grew up and did everything together. My first memory of us together was maybe we were 4 or 5 years old, and we were dressing up. I think it was for Halloween, but maybe it was just to play dress up. I don't know. He dressed up like a lion or something like that, but I had this like skeleton costume, like this apron that made it look like you could see my ribs, and I had bones everywhere. And then there was this like hood that made it look like a skull cap, and I painted my face white and put black rings around my eyes, and there was two inflatable skeleton heads, two inflatable skulls that sat on my shoulders because a three-headed skeleton makes sense. I remember us going to the sand dunes and playing. I remember he got bit by fire ants and he was miserable. I remember we were playing karate and I kicked him in the ribs and I feel terrible about it. My aunt gave me a talking to and I deserved that talking to. Richard and I loved WWF wrestling. My favorite was Hulk Hogan. His favorite was the Ultimate Warrior. And we knew all the wrestlers' names. We knew Mr. Perfect and Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Superfly Jimmy Snuka, Greg the Hammer Valentine, Rugged Ronnie Garvin, the Rockers, Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty. We knew all of them. We'd go to the live events at the Anaheim Convention Center at the LA Sports Arena. We'd always watch it at home on TV, and then when there were special events, we'd get them on pay-per-view. When we'd hear the ice cream truck coming around in his neighborhood, we'd quickly run to the couches and look for all the change we could find and beg for our parents and scrounge up the money. And when we had it, we'd run outside hoping we wouldn't miss the ice cream man, and we would order a wrestling ice cream bar. Every weekend, we would beg our moms to drive us to each other's houses so we could spend the weekend together, but they didn't do that often, so we became pen pals. We'd write letters back and forth every week, and I called him Rich, and he called me Flea. I remember staying the night at his house. We slept in the garage, and I was laying down, and the lights were out. We were going to bed, and I kind of sat up, not fully, just like maybe halfway to get a drink of water, and he tapped the bottom of the cup, and the water went sploosh on my face and up my nose, and I was coughing, and it surprised me because it was really cold water. I was mad, and he was laughing. I remember one time we stayed the night at my house and we were drinking orange juice from these kind of like champagne glasses, and the stem of the champagne glass was hollow. So like the juice filled that and then up in the glass part. And I finished my orange juice and I was looking up, and all the way in the bottom of the stem, there was a dead spider like crumpled up like this. I had been drinking dead spider orange juice and I was so grossed out, but he was laughing hysterically. We used to go to this amusement park called Castle Park that was kind of close to his house, and it was a smaller park that had a few roller coasters, this water log ride, and several of the kind of rides you'd see at like a carnival or a fair. And they had a mini golf course, but we didn't do any of that stuff. We would go to the arcade. There was a 3-story arcade with hundreds of arcade games. We would play games and eat hot dogs, and we'd try to play other games, but we'd always gravitate back to WrestleFest and Street Fighter 2. They were our favorite games, and we'd stay there all day and we'd play games and eat hot dogs. I remember we'd go to the 7-Eleven. We'd walk to the 7-Eleven. Both of us had 7-Eleven sort of nearby, and our houses, and we'd walk, and we'd get Red Vine's licorice and Skittles. We'd get Slurpees. We'd get Big Bites, and back then every 7-Eleven had a Street Fighter 2, or at least most of them, Street Fighter 2 machine, and we'd play Street Fighter 2, save our quarters, and go there and play. We were learning to play guitar around the same time. We had just met some new friends, and we were planning a trip to Six Flags Magic Mountain. Now, that was a huge roller coaster park in Valencia, and we had planned on going there. And that night, we were going to sleep in this guy named John's chicken coop. Now, I had never met John before, so I met him, and we were staying over there, but we didn't do much sleeping. We were out causing trouble most of the night. I remember at one point in the night, it was earlier, because we were pretty much up all night, but it was like 11 or 12, we heard screaming inside the house, and I hadn't even gone in the house. And John got up and ran to the house, and his sister opened the door, and she yelled, "Help!" And John went in, and the door slammed behind them, and we tried to go in, but the door was locked. And we heard banging, and we heard shouting and screaming, and the door flew open, and John and his sister ran out crying. And we were like, what happened? What happened? But they wouldn't tell us. But it was pretty obvious that John's brother was beating them up, and even worse. And the rest of the night, we just kind of ran around the neighborhood and caused trouble. And in the middle of the night, I got tired, and I went to the chicken coop and slept for an hour or maybe 2 hours. They came and woke me up in the early hours of the morning and said, "Hey, we found a shopping cart." And I got in, and John was pushing me around in the shopping cart. And that was fun for a minute until we got to this huge hill. I mean, it was a huge hill. And he started pushing me faster and faster. And I was saying, "John, stop, stop, stop. But he wouldn't stop, faster and faster. I was yelling, John, stop, faster and faster. I tried to put my foot down, and my foot went underneath the shopping cart, crunch, and rolled. It hurt so bad I was screaming, stop, and he was just laughing. And then finally the cart flipped, and we stopped. I couldn't even get up to walk, and he just walked away laughing and left me there. I couldn't even make it back to his house. We had to call my aunt. They had to walk back and call my aunt, and she had to come pick me up. I'm sure that wasn't pleasant for her in the wee hours of the morning to come pick me up. I iced my ankle and rested for the next several days because I still wanted to go to Magic Mountain. And I know they won't let you ride the rides if you have like crutches or like back then if you had like a cast or some kind of brace on there, they wouldn't let you ride the rides. And so I was trying to get better. And one of the days while I was just waiting to get better, I was at my grandma's house and I picked up the phone and I called a girl named Candace. Now, Richard's older brother's name was Eric, and Candace was Eric's girlfriend. And I called Candace and she was crying. And I said, Candace, what's wrong? And she said, I can't tell you. Call Eric. And she hung up. And I'm like, what? So I call her back. I'm like, Candace, you can tell me. It's fine. And she said, no, I can't tell you. And she's still crying. Call Eric. And she hung up. Now, I thought maybe her and Eric had been arguing or, they broke up or something like that, something trivial. And I called Eric, and Eric was crying. And I said, Eric, what's wrong? And he said, I can't tell you. And he hung up. And I was getting tired of being hung up on. And I called him again. I said, Eric, you have to tell me. I want to know what's wrong. And it didn't sound like he was really crying. It sounded like he was fake crying, like to the point where he was like laughing, And he said, Richard's been shot. And I didn't believe him. I said, Eric, stop playing. That's not even funny. He said, no, I'm serious. Richard's been shot. And it was like somebody punched me because it was like my head jolted and I saw stars and the room was spinning. And I said, is he dead? And Eric said, I don't know. That night in the chicken coop, I realized something was off about John and the whole family situation there. But as 13, I didn't know what to do about it. What happened was Richard was over at John's house and John got his brother's gun. And he murdered Richard. He shot him in the heart, and Richard did die. I was crushed and devastated and heartbroken, and I cried for days. I went to the funeral, and they had an open casket viewing where you can actually look inside and see the person. And the guy in charge of the funeral home must have done a great job because Richard had his hair combed and he was in a suit and his hands were folded like this on his chest and his lips were up like a smile, and he had put the makeup on him so he didn't look like he was dead, and he looked so alive still. I halfway expected him to sit up and for us to talk and play like we always had, but I knew he wouldn't sit up and we'd never play together again. I sobbed waiting for the viewing. I sobbed during the viewing. When I saw him, I had some things in my pockets that I knew he loved. And in the casket, I put a Snickers bar and a wrestling item. I don't remember what the wrestling item was, an M80 firecracker. And I went in the hallway and I fell on the ground and sobbed. During the funeral service, I cried the whole time with my head down. Went to the reception at my aunt's house and I just cried the whole time. For weeks, I just cried. I didn't want to eat. I didn't want to go anywhere. I just wanted to lay in bed and cry. I was absolutely crushed. And I wondered, why did this happen? How could God let this happen? And here I am so many years later, and my heart still hurts. And it's still painful, and I still miss him. And I still wonder, why did God let this happen? And I'll be honest, I don't know. So what I'm about to say is just like my blind stab in the dark, my best guess. But after my cousin died, sometime later, my uncle became a believer. He repented and believed on Jesus. But he also got cancer. And it was bad. And he'd go to treatments and he'd have to sleep a lot during the day. And he had a big bandage on his head. And after Richard had died, they built a park across the street that wasn't there when when he and I were hanging out. And what my uncle would do is every day he'd take his naps and he'd go across the street and he'd tell people about Jesus. He'd get his treatment, he'd take his naps, he'd go across the street, and he'd tell people about Jesus. He'd get his treatments, he'd take his naps, he'd go across the street, and he'd tell people about Jesus. And eventually my uncle also passed away. But before he did, he told thousands of people about Jesus. Now listen, I don't know, I can't pretend to know the reasons why God lets bad things happen because I'm not God. But I do know that God has this big cosmic plan that's bigger than me and it's bigger than you. But we get to be a part of it. We're part of this plan, but it's not all about us. It's all about him. And in his plan, according to Isaiah 45, he is saving sinners from all over the world. And one day, these sinners that he saves will all bow down and worship Jesus. And it's going to be glorious. When the bad thing happens, it's not glorious. It hurts and it's painful. And we suffer and we ask the question, why? But someday, when all of us sinners who've been saved by God's grace from all nations all around the world bow down and worship Jesus, it's going to be glorious. And we're going to see God's final plan fulfilled. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Big Truths. It is a little more serious, but I genuinely hope that you appreciate it. And you remember, when you go through tough times, when bad things happen, it will hurt, and it's okay. It's okay for us to be hurt. And it's okay for us to even wonder why it's happening. But please remember, God loves you very much. And God has this really big cosmic plan. And he's bringing it all together into something glorious. So we just trust him. And we ask him to give us the grace to make it through these hard times. Our memory verse this week is Isaiah 45:7. I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am Yahweh who does all these things. Guys, just so that you know, next week I won't be uploading a preaching video because at Calvary Kids Wednesday next week we're having a play night. That's because on Friday next week I am going to preach at an outreach somewhere else. And so we scheduled a play night for all of us to just fellowship and play together. Maybe I'll upload that preaching though, because the very next week after that, I'll have a normal Big Truths video, but also we have our laser tag outreach event. And so I'll be preaching for that also. And let me know if you guys want me to upload that, and I'll do that as well. Guys, it's good seeing you again. Sorry we missed last week. We got a weird weather thing happening here with like crazy temperatures and ice and all this stuff, so we had to cancel our Wednesday night. But God willing, we'll be right back to normal. Not next week, but the week after that. Until then, I'll see you guys next time. Mr. Forrest out.